What if I told you that in 2001, somebody predicted the entire Halo story over a decade in advance?
Say what?
Were they a time traveler? Well, quite possibly. It's fair to say though that their message from the future fell on deaf ears, at least until now. So recently, I've been going through some ancient Halo archives, sifting through the oldest theories about Halo's story and lore, some of which even predate the Master Chief. Now, some of these theories are insane, and others are equally insane, but in a weirdly accurate way, predicting major events in Halo's story 10-15 years in advance down to suspiciously accurate detail. And today, we're gonna blow the lid off them. Right, to begin, we've got to cover this theory about Halo's broader story first, which was posted over a year before the game released. Reason being, its author was so boldly confident about his theory that he warned people not to read it or he'll ruin the story for them, and he even feared people mobbing his house for doing so. So before we go through it, give me your predictions down in the comments as to how accurate you think this author, this Howard fella, actually was. So, the theory questions the purpose of the Halo rings, which at the time nobody really knew anything about, and it suggests a number of things. Firstly, that the Halos hold cool stuff left behind by the Yarrow, more on those guys in a minute. Secondly, that they house some kind of ancient superweapon. And thirdly, that the Halo rings are dormant gateways. So, let's go through those in order. What are the Yarrow? Well, in Bungie's previous games, Pathways into Darkness and Marathon, the Yarrow were essentially that universe and by extension the wider Bungieverse's Foreigners. These theories were written at a time when people assumed that Halo was going to be a Marathon game and would in a way continue its story, and although it didn't, at least directly, a ton of narrative content from Marathon laid the groundwork for the entirety of Halo's universe and formed some of its most important elements, one of the prime examples being the Yarrow. And in saying that the Yarrow, or rather in Halo's case the Foreigners, left cool stuff behind on the Halos, well, our boy Howard was pretty much bang on. They left the Flood, and you know what, if you ask me, I think the Flood are pretty damn cool. He was also at least mostly correct in saying that the Halos house an ancient superweapon. I mean, they don't exactly house an ancient superweapon, they are an ancient superweapon, but, you know, semantics. But the larger discussion in this theory was about the Halos being dormant gateways. Now, Howard's reasoning for this is that the Halos builders are an ancient spacefaring race who travel between galaxies and, presumably, per Bungie tradition, have huge ships, and so they created the Halos as portals to allow them to FTL travel. He also says that the Covenant chased the humans to the ring because they were afraid of us activating its gateway, and further, that other species on planets around the ring, and I quote, are well aware of it and probably have some sort of pact between themselves to stay away from it, hence why the ring is empty and mostly devoid of life when we get there. It's also apparently a nice excuse to have old technology laying around and also to allow for a cool suspenseful ending, which are two things that actually did end up being very true. He goes into more detail, stating that the Halo having gravity means that it can manipulate it, thus making the concept of folding possible. So folding was something in Marathon and apparently in Star Trek as well, where basically you can fold space-time up to allow for fast travel of large distances. So, it kinda goes without saying, but for the most part, our boy Howard was barking up the wrong tree with his theory here. I can definitely see why he thought the Halos could be gateways. I mean, when they're in space, they do kinda look like massive portal generators, and also the Covenant chasing humanity to it to stop them from using the gateway to escape them also kinda makes sense with what few story details there were at this time, but the rest of it is unfortunately very incorrect. Luckily, old Howard's fear of people mobbing his house because he ruined the entire Halo story for them likely never happened. His Halo theory may have been woefully incorrect, but hey, at least Howard's house is still standing. I hope. However, this next theory is quite the opposite to Howard's, and it's gonna blow your mind because when I was reading it, it blew mine. It's the only theory that I'm going to cover today that was posted after Halo 1 released, albeit only a month after, but how accurately it predicts elements of Halo's story and lore that weren't written for like over a decade after is genuinely insane. The theory is called Halo and History, and it's written by a guy called Knight Premier, and it revolves around Bungie's affinity for the number 7. The the number 7's relevance in the Bible, and also the insight that gives into certain elements of Halo's lore. Now, this theory is heavily biblical, which, if you ask me, is actually one of the coolest elements of Halo's overarching story, and it's also probably why stuff in this theory lines up so well. So, it starts out with Knight making a startlingly accurate assumption that the Flood were released by a godlike race and were used to purify the universe of what these gods perceived as evil, as was the case in the Book of Genesis. He also says that the Flood were released from heaven, which is not only a really cool allegory, but when you look at the lore, it kind of in a way could be skewed to make sense. But as we know in Halo's very much cemented lore, the Flood were the corrupted malformation of the Precursors, Halo's god species, who returned to the galaxy as a divine punishment against the Foreigners for their violent genocide of them. That's 1 point for Knight already. He then says that the Halo rings acted like the Ark in Genesis, protecting samples of life from the Flood while the Halos wiped them out, which is, again, another mostly true assumption. Granted, at this point in Halo, there was no Ark, but the assumption that the Halos are akin to the biblical Ark isn't entirely incorrect, given that anything on a Halo ring is immune to its effects. And then later on, he also hypothesizes that Earth itself could actually be Halo's equivalent to the biblical Ark, which originally was in fact Bungie's plan. What later became the portal to the Ark was originally intended to be the Ark, buried on Earth, so again, another point for Knight. After the Halos are fired, he theorized that creatures within the Ark were then released, thus beginning the history of mankind with an exodus from the Ark to the Promised Land, Earth, from which humanity expanded. Of course, the Exodus to the Promised Land is a very famous biblical story, but this is also verbatim what happened after the Halos were fired. Key ships delivered human samples from the Ark to Earth, where our history then began before we eventually spread throughout the stars. The theory then switches focus from the Flood and the Ark to the Covenant, pondering what the Covenant actually are and why they attacked humanity. And in doing so, Knight cites various passages from the Bible, starting out with this one. The evil entities are those who choose to follow Lucifer. Their minds were covered with a horrible dark deception. They are now agents of the adversary, controlled under his dominion and servants of his enterprise. And once again, this is a fascinatingly accurate early description of the Covenant, where the evil entities within, like the elites, the grunts, the jackals, and the brutes, have their minds shrouded in a dark deception by Lucifer, the prophets, of whom they serve and are under the control of. Later on in the theory, Knight also says, I believe that the Covenant may be following a false prophet, which is why they are called the Covenant. They believe that they are aligned with God and are fighting for their God against their Satan/satanic armies, when in fact, they have been deceived and are fighting the true God. And I mean, that's like word for word accurate, from the lies of the prophets to the Covenant's war with the true reclaimers of the Foreigner's mantle. I swear to God, this man was such a prophet, they may as well have called him Ordcasto. Good lord. He then moves on to the infamous book of Revelations, which is basically the Apocalypse book. So, Revelations mentions 7 churches of the Apocalypse, all of which have 7 guardian angels, which he uses to hypothesize that there are 7 Halo rings and 7 monitors guarding them. Again, bang on. Revelations also contains a passage about Jesus. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. He had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp sword. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat on him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were like a flame of fire. He had a name written that no one knew except himself. And out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he might strike the nations. And Knight theorizes that this passage, or these strung together passages, could all be referencing the Master Chief. In fact, he even goes as far as saying that it makes Chief the personification of a Christ-like savior, and his evidence is the following. Spark mentioning an encounter that he'd already had with Chief in Alpha Halo's control room, which accounts for Chief being the Alpha and the Omega, the first to light the rings, and if he had lit Alpha Halo, the last. The 7 stars refer to the 7 monitors of the 7 Halo rings. The sharp sword that Jesus wields could refer to Chief wielding Cortana, of whom was named after the sword Cortana from the Song of Roland. The The first chapter of the Maw is called The Horse You Rode In On, referencing the white horse. Chief's gold-orangey visor accounts for his eyes were like a flame of fire, and the fact that nobody knows Chief's full name besides himself fits with Jesus having a name written that no one knew except himself. So, is Master Chief Jesus reincarnate? Well, as far as we're aware, no. However, you could loosely interpret these glaring similarities as part of the gayesh that the librarian ensured Chief would have, which makes him something of a chosen one. Well, it's either that or Chief actually is Jesus. I mean, John 1:17 is a Bible verse, so maybe that explains his divine luck. But overall, how accurate was this theory? Well, pretty damn accurate, it's fair to say, and very far in advance as well. But honestly, if anything, how accurate this theory is kind of just proves how intrinsically biblical Halo's story is. I mean, when you can predict things like the precursors a decade before their inception just by following the Bible, it's kind of hard to deny that Halo was massively inspired by biblical stories. Okay, on a very different note to biblical stories, if you guys are after a beautiful brand new PC, well, look no further than my flood-themed PCs made in partnership with Apex Gaming PCs. From the Pure Form to the Gravemind and the Primordial, we have 3 builds of varying power and budget to suit your specific needs. Just head to the link in the description and pick one of these bad boys up today. Okay, this next theory is a rather short one, but it links to Marathon, so you know that I had to cover it. It was written by ICONIC in October 2000, so a year before Halo released, and it's called The Black Demon. How very ominous. It's based on a passage from the Cortana letters, where Cortana says, "I've had the strangest dreams lately. Raging seas, howling beasts, a demon folded in black clouds." And Iden infers that Cortana is having dreams of the Workenkakenter from Marathon. So the Workenkakenter is essentially Marathon's equivalent to Halo's Primordial. It's this ancient entity of pure chaos that, if freed from its solar prison, would bring total destruction upon the galaxy. And back in the pre-Halo 1 release era, all the Marathon references that Bungie had laced into Halo material had fans thinking, or rather assuming, that Halo was going to be part of Marathon's universe, and thus the Workenkakenter would play a role. Now, of course, we know that that's not what ended up happening, and sadly, neither did Iden's theory of Cortana wanting to seize the Workenkakenter to further her megalomaniac plans, but goddamn would it have been cool if Halo's story went in that direction one day. I will say, there is a loose parallel to this in Halo's lore right now. Mannequin bias siding with the Primordial, the two essentially becoming the leaders of the Flood, is kind of similar to the concept of Cortana freeing and working with the Workenkakenter to further her evil plans, but it's not exactly one-to-one. Either way, I just feel tormented by the fact that Sony own the Marathon IP now, and Halo can't really reference it anymore. I swear to God, Halo's lore is at its absolute peak when it's intertwined with Marathon, and it kind of sucks that Sony just won't let that happen anymore. Oh well, on to the next one. Staying on the Marathon track, we have a duo of theories that connect Halo to Marathon in a far more convincing way, in a way that kind of still has relevance outside of just the connection, and both of them revolve around the Yarrow. Now, just a very quick reminder again, the Yarrow are basically another of the many coincidental parallels between Halo and Marathon. They're essentially the Forerunners of the Marathon universe that are almost identical to Halo's Forerunners in every way, and are one of the greatest connections between Halo and the wider Bungieverse. So, the first of these two theories was posted in February 2000 by Super Opera Boy, who noticed something rather interesting and familiar in the Yarrow logo that pops up in one of the Marathon terminals. So, if you zoom in on this logo, the detailing on the lemniscate kind of looks like a section from a Halo ring, at least in his assumption. Now personally, I don't see this, but what I do see is that the detailing looks a little bit similar to the detailing on Halo 1's logo, or if not that specific, just kind of generic Foreigner detailing. Is this a coincidence? Yeah, probably. The next theory, posted in May 2000 by VKDude, which is the most 2000s name ever, piggybacks off the original theory and revolves around the final level of the Marathon trilogy. So this level, which is called IMAX Secure, is a Yaro space station with the ability to create a singularity to trap and neutralize the working Kakanta. The shape of the Yaro facility also just so happens to be a ring. So the theory questions whether the Halo rings are just another kind of Yaro station, and to a degree that's kind of true. I mean, Bungie based the Foreigners almost entirely on the Yaro. They're so similar that they could honestly just be the same species if Bungie ever decided to unify Marathon and Halo's universe, and so it stands to reason that people would assume that an ancient ring structure in space was made by the Yaro. But don't worry, it goes further than that. So the purpose of the IMAX Secure Station is very similar to what ended up being the purpose of the Halos, albeit indirectly. So the Yaro station in Marathon Infinity was used to create multiple gravitational fields, which, when focused, created a singularity which swallowed the sun the working Kakanta was imprisoned in, thus defeating it. And then in Halo, the Halos fire a pulse of deadly radiation that instantly kills any sentient life, thus indirectly defeating the Flood. The working Kakanta was essentially Marathon's equivalent to the Primordial, who in Halo was the first Gravemind, so I think you can see the similarities. By no means is the Yaro station identical to the Halo rings, but both games' respective ring-shaped structures are used to neutralize the ultimate final threat to each respective galaxy. So, VKDude was, at least loosely, definitely onto something here, but you can kinda just attribute that to how deeply rooted in Marathon's universe elements of Halo's lore are. Now then, this next theory is really interesting. It piggybacks off that forgotten Halo lore that I spoke about a few weeks ago that came out before Halo 1, the Transmissions, but it connects the Transmissions to another work of fiction that offers some very interestingly accurate insights into future Halo lore that at this point, I don't think Bungie had even remotely thought of. So according to the theorist, Darcy Brockbank, the Transmissions share a ton of glaring similarities with Ian M. Banks' Culture series of books. And you know what? They're absolutely not wrong in that. The way that Bungie named ships and also styled the transmissions of the Transmissions is really similar to how they were done in the Culture series. But getting to the point, in another one of Ian M. Banks' books, which is called Against a Dark Background, which isn't actually part of the Culture series, the name Halo makes an appearance, in which it's referred to as a machine intelligence / habitat, is said to be in interplanetary space, and is suggested to be destroyed at some time in the past history of the system. And you know what? All three of those assumptions about the Halo rings in Halo are accurate in varying ways. Firstly, a Halo ring could be described as a habitat, considering that they shelter wildlife and, their surface is comprised of an almost entirely natural environment that's also home to some creatures that may or may not have been seen elsewhere. A little bit of a loose assumption there, but I think you can make it. As for the machine intelligence bit, well, you could definitely make the argument that that's referring to a Halo's monitor. You can't have a Halo without a monitor. But you can also say that it's referring to the subsystems of a Halo. I assume that, like the Ark, Halos are populated by automated daemons that carry out subroutines and the like, which, again, would technically make a Halo ring a machine intelligence. Secondly, of course, Halos are located in interplanetary space, that's a given. And thirdly, the ring being destroyed at some point in the past. Well, if you extrapolate the information from Against the Dark Background to be referring to not just one specific Halo ring, but rather the Halos in general, that's also very true. And more than that, it's lore that wouldn't be cemented in Halo's universe for I don't even know, 11, 12, 13 years at the earliest. So, prior to the 7 Halo rings that we see in the games, which were part of the Neoteric array of rings, there was what was called the senescent array of 12 larger Halos that, besides one which became Zeta Halo, were all destroyed to make way for the Neoteric rings, which very easily explains the ring, or rings, being destroyed at some point in the past. However, on the other hand, you could take this as a lighter hint that the only Halo ring that people had seen at the time, Alpha Halo, would be destroyed at some point, as it was at the end of Halo 1's campaign. Either way though, the small tidbits of information about Halo in Ian Banks' Against the Dark background predict the events of Halo very strangely accurately, and thus, so does this theory. And finally, this wouldn't be a Halo lore video if we didn't talk about the dark secret origins of the Master Chief. So, this final theory was written at a time when the name Master Chief didn't even exist. The earliest marketing for Halo described Chief as a military recon unit of the human race's fledgling planetary empire, which made Bungie fans at the time all jump to the same conclusion. Halo's main character was one of the Lost Marines from Marathon. So, some context. In Marathon, you play as a cyborg named Mjolnir Recon 54, who was one of 10 Marine battle droids aboard the UESC Marathon. However, we learn in Marathon 1 that the other 9 Mjolnir Recon units were sent down to the colony of Tau Ceti, whilst you were the only one to return to the ship to defend it. And of course, with hindsight, we all know that Chief's armor is designated Mjolnir, and also that Recon is a super important term in Halo as well. Chief is also part of a wider program to create biologically and cybernetically augmented super soldiers, which are almost identical to the battle droids, so there's a lot of connections here. Which begs the question, is the Master Chief, who we really think he is now, I'm joking, is the Chief one of the 9 lost Mjolnir Recon battle droids? Well, of course, as we know now, he's not. There's a lot of evidence that suggested that he could have been, but that's only because Halo and Marathon share so much DNA. The funny thing is as well, right, unless Halo was a prequel to Marathon, which would make no sense at all, even if the two games were in the same universe, this theory still wouldn't line up, because all 9 of the Lost Recon units that Chief is supposedly one of were killed on Tau Ceti between Marathon 1 and Marathon 2. So I might be a quarter of a century late in saying this, but I'm sorry, Joseph E. Hacker, your theory is yet another one of the ones that go in the nice try, but you're completely wrong bin. And those, my friends, are the oldest Halo theories on the internet and in existence, solved, as much as some of them could be solved. Let me know down in the comments which late 90s/early 2000s schizo Halo lore post was your favourite. For me, it's gotta be the biblical one. I just think how well Halo's story lines up with stuff that people were predicting from the Bible like 25 years ago is absolutely insane. And so, with that said, let's round this video out there. I want to give a massive thank you to all of my amazing patrons for the continued support over there, as per usual, and thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And I'll catch you all in the next one.